Hello. In this video, we're going to be talking about midpoints and endpoints of a line segment. This includes finding the midpoint given two endpoints and finding an endpoint given the other endpoint and a midpoint. So let's get started. First off, what is a midpoint of a line segment? Well, the midpoint is the point that's halfway between the two endpoints. So if we have a line segment, let me get my line right. All right, so if we have a line segment that looks something like this, and we want to find the midpoint. We need to find the point that's halfway between these 2 points. All right, so there's a couple of different ways we can do this. Looking at it visually like this, I'm going to find halfway between these 2 points, or halfway vertically, and then halfway horizontally. And where those two things meet up is going to be the midpoint of this line segment. So here we go. All right, so uh, vertically here, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the midpoint is if I go down 3, which is right here. That's the midpoint of the rise or the drop, the change in y. Now, for the change in x here, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 as well. So right there is the midpoint for that. So whenever I combine the two, so let's make this green. So when I combine the two things and I try to find the point where they cross on the line, it's right there. So this point right here is the midpoint of that line segment. Another way you can think about it, to get from this point to this point, we went down 6 and over 6. So to go halfway, we would go down 3, which is half of the amount we went down, and then over 3, which is half the amount we went over. So if we do that twice, we get to the other endpoint. Now, it's all well and good to be able to look at a graph and do this. Sometimes things don't come out that well, and sometimes you're given endpoints that are really far apart or don't fit on a graph well. So we need a formula for this. All right, so to figure out the midpoint with the x values, so from here to here, you take the average of the x values. To find the midpoint vertically, you find the average of the y values. And so the equation looks something like this. Now, the midpoint is exactly that. It's a midpoint. It is a point. I have some students that forget that it is two different things, and when they see this formula, they try to combine it into one thing, and it's not. It's the x value and the y value for the midpoint. So the average of the x's, you take x1 plus x2. That's just your x values for your points and divide it by 2. And for the average of the y's, you add the y values together and divide that by 2 as well. So in our example down here, it says find the midpoint of a line segment with ends at 1, 3, and 7, negative 5. So looking at this, the first values are your x's. The second values are your y's. So I'm going to take the sum of my x's, which is 1 plus 7, and divide that by 2 to find my x value. And then to find my y value, I take and I add my y values together, and then divide that by 2. And this is going to find the midpoint. All right, so 1 plus 7 is 8, divided by 2 is 4. 3 minus 5 is negative 2, divided by positive 2 is negative 1. So the midpoint between these two endpoints is 4, negative 1. Now I'm going to copy this graph real quick so we can graph these things, and so we can see what this looks like visually. All right, so we can move my work out of the way. All right, so I'm going to graph the point 1, 3. 1, 1, 2, 3. 0.7, negative 5 might be a problem. I think I only have 6. No, I think I have 7. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, negative 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there are my two endpoints in this, uh, in this, sorry, problem. Got a little brain dead there for a second. I apologize. So there's my two endpoints. There's my line segment. I want to find the midpoint of this. And so when we did the math, it came out that the midpoint was 4, negative 1. So 1, 2, 3, 4, negative 1. Right there it is. All right. So now that we've done the midpoint, let's do the endpoint. In order to find the endpoints, you use the midpoint formula. So remember your midpoint formula. The x value for the midpoint and the y value for the midpoint is equal to the average of the x's, so x1 plus x2 divided by 2, and the average of the y's, y1 plus y2 divided by 2. So to find each individual part of the midpoint, you can set x equal to the average of the x coordinates and y equal to the average of the y's. So this is what it looks like. We have the endpoint is 2, 5, and the midpoint is negative 2, 9. So we have one endpoint. This is the x values. I'm going to do the x values first. All right. So the x value for the in the midpoint is negative 2. The way you find it would be you add the two x values for your endpoints together and divide by 2. Well, we know what one of them is. One of them is 2, but we don't know what the other endpoint is. So I'm gonna let that be x2. You can let it be whatever variable you want. You could even let it be x if you really wanted to. I'm just going to pretend like I'm just plugging these values into my formula here, though, so I'm going to leave it x2. And then we divide that by 2. For the y values, same deal, except with the y's. So our midpoint, the y value for the midpoint is 9. So that's going to equal to the y value for the endpoint, which is 5, plus the other y value for the endpoint, which we don't know, so I'm going to let that be y sub 2, divided by 2. And now we have to solve these equations to figure out the x value and the y value for the endpoint. Alright, so the first thing we need to do is get rid of this division right here because everything up here is being divided by 2. Now I can do one of two things. I can either go ahead and divide both parts by 2, or I can do what I prefer, which is to multiply both sides by 2. In this case, it wouldn't be that bad either way because 2 divided by 2 is 1. But over here, 5 divided by 2 gives us a fraction, and I know how much most of my students absolutely love fractions, which they try to avoid them like the plague. So, alright, so multiplying both sides by 2 gives me negative 4. On this side, I get 2 plus negative 4, 2 plus x sub 2, because these things cancel out. My next step, I'm going to add 2 to both sides. And so I get the x value for this endpoint is negative 2. All right, for the y value, I do the same thing. I want to start out by multiplying both sides by 2. 2 times 9 is 18. Those cancel out. I'm left with 5 plus y sub 2. Next step, I want to subtract 5 from both sides. And so I get y sub 2 is equal to 13. And so the other endpoint is at negative 2, 13. Now, one thing we need to do anytime we do a problem like this is to check our answer, make sure it makes sense. All right, so looking at this, going from 2 to -2, you would expect the endpoint to be farther negative than what I had in my answer here. So I got to look back through here and see what I did wrong. And looking right here, I added 2 to both sides. And I didn't need to do that. I needed to subtract 2 from both sides. Alright, so if I subtract 2, then these things cancel out. And I'm left with -6 instead of -2. Alright, so now if you think about the endpoints, you can actually kind of do this intuitively as well. If I go from 2 to -2, then I go down by 4. Now you have to make sure you're starting at an endpoint and going to the midpoint when you do this though. So from 2 to -2, I go down 4. So if we went down 4 more, I would be at -6. If I go from 5 to 9, I go up 4. So if I go up 4 more, I get to 13. And that's another way to think about it uh, intuitively instead of with formulas and things like that. All right, let's do one more example. All right, so uh, in this word problem, Hunter figures that if he can cast his line in the middle of the river, then he will have the best chance of catching a big catfish. He finds a section on a map that looks to be a good spot. Now, on the bank of the river, one bank of the river is at the point 26 on the map, and the other bank is at 79. Where would the spot he wants to cast be located on the map? So we're trying to find the midpoint between these 2 points, because he's wanting to cast in the middle of the river. Okay, so uh, we're going to find the average of the x's and the average of the y's. So the midpoint is going to be 2 plus 7 divided by 2. And then for the y coordinate, it's going to be 6 plus 9 divided by 2. 2 plus 7 is 9. So it's going to be 9 divided by 2, which is 4.5. 6 plus 9, which is 15 divided by 2, which is 7.5. I'm going to leave them as fractions because it's just as good as anything. And I actually prefer fractions. But our final answer can have some fractions. Don't be scared of them. There they are. If you wanted to know what it was uh, with decimals instead of fractions, it's 4.5 and then 7.5. Now, once again, look and make sure that this makes sense. Our answer makes sense. Is 4.5 between 7 and 2? Yes, it is. Is 7.5 between 9 and 6? Yes, it is. So, looks like it's a good. Looks like we did it right. All right, well, I hope this helps. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment, and I hope you have a good one.